For as long as I can remember, I always felt like a part of me was missing. It wasn't because I had a bad childhood, in fact, I had a wonderful life. My parents, Mark and Linda, were loving, supportive, and gave me everything I could have ever needed. They were there for every scraped knee, every school project, every late-night talk about my future. They were my parents in every way that mattered. But deep down, there was always that nagging question in the back of my mind: where did I come from? I was adopted as a baby, and my parents never kept it a secret from me. They always told me, "You were chosen. We wanted you so much, and the moment we saw you, we knew you were meant to be ours." It was a beautiful sentiment, and I believed them. But as I got older, I started to wonder about the people who had given me away. Who were they? What did they look like? Did I have their eyes, their smile, their laugh? Did they ever think about me? Did they regret their decision? The questions piled up over the years, growing louder and louder, until one day, I realized I couldn't ignore them anymore. By the time I was a teenager, I found myself searching for clues in the smallest things. My parents both had brown hair, mine was black. My mom's eyes were blue, mine were dark brown. I would stare in the mirror, wondering who else in the world had my face. I never told my parents about these thoughts. I didn't want them to feel like they weren't enough, because they were. But at the same time, I felt this deep, unshakable need to know where I came from. The day I turned 18, I decided I was ready. I started with the little information I had, my birth certificate, the few details my parents knew. They had always told me that if I ever wanted to search, they would support me, and they kept that promise. But even as they helped me dig through old records and navigate legal documents, I could see the quiet sadness in their eyes. I knew what they were thinking: are we not enough? And that killed me. But I couldn't stop. The more I searched, the more obsessed I became. I pored over online databases, adoption forums, and DNA ancestry tests, chasing every tiny lead that might bring me closer to an answer. Months passed. Then a year. Then 2. And then, one day, I got a match. A name. A location. A woman who, according to the records, had given birth to a baby boy the same day I was born. My biological mother. I had spent years preparing for this moment, imagining all the different ways it could go. Would she be excited to hear from me? Would she cry and say she had been waiting for this day? Or would she refuse to see me, too ashamed to face what she had done? I had no idea what to expect. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. When I finally tracked down my birth mother's information, my hands trembled as I stared at the screen. Her name was Julia Reynolds. She lived 3 states away, in a small town I had never heard of. My heartbeat pounded as I looked at her picture, the first face I had ever seen that looked like mine. It was surreal. I had spent years wondering if I had her eyes, her nose, her smile. And now, staring at that photo, I realized I did. It was like looking at a distant, older version of myself. I debated for days whether or not to reach out. What if she didn't want to hear from me? What if she had moved on? What if she had a new family now, one where I didn't belong? But I had come too far to turn back. So, I wrote a message. "Hi, my name is Daniel. I believe you may be my biological mother. I don't want to disrupt your life, but I've spent years wondering about where I came from. If you're open to it, I would love to talk." I must have rewritten it 10 times before finally pressing send. Then, I waited. For days, there was nothing. No reply. No indication that she had even seen the message. I told myself not to get my hopes up, but deep down, I felt that familiar sting of rejection creeping in. Maybe this was my answer. Maybe she wasn't going to acknowledge me at all. Then, after nearly a week, my phone buzzed. Her reply was short. I didn't think I'd ever hear from you. I'd be willing to talk. That was it. No emotion, no warmth, just a simple acknowledgement that she existed and that I had found her. Still, it was something. We started exchanging messages. At first, it was awkward, like talking to a stranger you were somehow supposed to have a deep connection with. She told me bits and pieces about herself, her job, her life, the fact that she had no other children. I asked her the question that had haunted me my entire life: why did you give me up? Her answer was simple, almost mechanical: I was young. I wasn't ready to be a mother. I did what I thought was best. That was it. No deep regret. No emotional confession. Just a cold, factual statement. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe some part of me wanted her to say she never wanted to let me go, that she had been forced into it, that she had thought about me every single day. But that wasn't the case. She had moved on. I was a part of her past, not her present. And that hurt in a way I hadn't prepared for. Despite the emotional distance, we agreed to meet in person. I flew out to her town, heart pounding as I walked into the little cafe where we had agreed to meet. I spotted her immediately, the woman who had given me life, sitting across from me like any other stranger. We talked, but it didn't feel like a reunion. There were no tears, no long-lost connection. She wasn't cruel, but she wasn't particularly warm either. It was clear that she saw me as a chapter she had already closed. I had spent years chasing this moment, hoping it would give me some kind of closure, some sense of belonging. But instead, all I felt was emptiness. When I left that cafe, I realized the truth that had been right in front of me all along. My real parents were the ones who had raised me. The ones who had stayed up with me when I was sick, who cheered me on at school plays, who told me bedtime stories and hugged me when I was scared. The ones who had never once made me feel like I was an afterthought. I had spent years searching for where I came from, only to realize that home had always been with the people who chose me. When I got back, I hugged my parents tighter than I ever had before. I had finally found what I was looking for. And it had been with me all along. Story number 2. I took my dad to his favorite childhood spot one last time before he passed away. There are moments in life that seem small at the time, but later, you realize they were everything. That's what this story is for me. It was just a drive, just a simple day out, but in the end, it became one of the most precious memories I'll ever have. My dad, James, was the strongest man I ever knew. He wasn't the kind of father who gave long speeches or dramatic expressions of love, but he showed it in the small, everyday ways that mattered most. He was the one who made sure my car was running smoothly before I ever had to ask, the one who stayed up waiting whenever I came home late, the one who never said, "I love you," outright but always reminded me to wear a jacket when it was cold. He worked tirelessly to give our family a good life. He rarely took breaks, never indulged in extravagant things for himself, and always put everyone else first. His hands were rough from years of labor, his eyes carried the weight of responsibilities, but there was always a warmth in them. He was the foundation of our family, the person who held us together. Then one day, everything changed. It started with a cough. Nothing serious at first, just a small irritation that wouldn't go away. Then, he started losing weight. He brushed it off, saying he was just getting older, that he was fine. But deep down, I think we all knew something wasn't right. By the time he finally went to the doctor, the diagnosis was stage 4 lung cancer. I remember sitting in that hospital room, feeling like the air had been sucked out of my lungs as the doctor spoke. My mom gripped my hand so tightly it hurt, but my dad? He just nodded, taking the news in without a single tear. That was who he was. He never wanted to make a scene, never wanted to worry anyone. But no amount of quiet acceptance could change what was coming. The doctors were clear. We had months, not years. The decline happened faster than I could process. One moment, he was still moving around the house, insisting on fixing a leaky faucet like he always did. The next, he could barely walk to the kitchen without having to sit down and catch his breath. His hands, once so steady and strong, began to tremble. His voice, once deep and unwavering, grew softer, weaker. Watching him change like that was one of the hardest things I've ever experienced. The man who had always carried me on his shoulders when I was little now needed me to hold his arm just to walk across the room. The man who had always been my protector now needed protecting. One night, I was sitting with him in the living room, just keeping him company while he rested. The TV was on, but neither of us was really watching. He seemed lost in thought, staring past the screen, his fingers absently tapping against the armrest of his chair. I hesitated before asking, "What are you thinking about, Dad?" He exhaled slowly, a small, tired smile forming on his lips. "When I was a kid," he said, "my dad used to take me to the lake. We'd sit on the dock for hours, just talking. It was my favorite place in the world." I had never heard him talk about this before. He spoke about it with such gentleness, such longing, like he was reliving the memory as he spoke. I could picture it in my mind, the warm summer sun reflecting off the water, my dad as a little boy, sitting beside his own father, feeling safe, feeling free. Something inside me ached at the way he talked about it. I realized then that there was so little time left. So many things he would never get to do again, so many moments that had already slipped through his fingers. But maybe, just maybe, I could give him this one last thing. I wasn't sure if he was strong enough to make the trip. I knew he wouldn't want to ask. But I also knew he needed it. The next morning, I made up my mind. I walked into the room where he was resting and told him we were going for a drive. He looked at me, confused. "A drive? Where to?" I smiled. "You'll see." At first, my dad hesitated. He wasn't the type to let people fuss over him, and even though his body was failing, his pride was still intact. He hated feeling like a burden. "I don't know, kid. I'm not exactly in road trip condition," he said, attempting a weak chuckle. But I wasn't taking no for an answer. "It's just a drive," I told him. "No pressure, no rush. Just you and me, like the old days." I could see the doubt in his eyes, but then something shifted. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was just exhaustion from fighting me on everything lately. But eventually, he sighed, nodded, and let me help him to the car. I packed a small bag with his medication, a bottle of water, and an old flannel jacket he always used to wear when we went on fishing trips together. I had no idea if he would need it, but something told me he would like having it with him. The drive was quiet at first. My dad stared out the window, watching the world pass by, his fingers lightly tapping on his knee like he always did when he was deep in thought. I kept sneaking glances at him, worried that he might suddenly say he wanted to turn around. But instead, I noticed something I hadn't seen in weeks, a small, peaceful smile. As we got closer to the lake, I saw his expression change. His tired eyes brightened, like he was recognizing an old friend he hadn't seen in years. "It looks the same," he murmured. And it did. The lake was still as beautiful as ever, stretching out like an endless mirror reflecting the sky. The wooden dock, though weathered, was still standing, creaking slightly with every soft ripple of water. The trees surrounding the shoreline swayed gently, just like they must have when he was a kid. It felt untouched by time, as if it had been waiting for him to return. I pulled into a small clearing, helped him out of the car, and together, we slowly made our way toward the dock. His steps were unsteady, but I stayed beside him, holding onto his arm like he had done for me when I was little. We sat down on the edge, our legs dangling over the water, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was comfortable, filled with the soft sounds of lapping water and rustling leaves. Then, my dad took a deep breath and closed his eyes. My dad used to sit right here, he said, patting the wooden planks beneath him. Every Sunday morning. He'd bring me down before breakfast, and we'd just sit. No talking, no distractions. Just this. I watched as he ran his fingers along the dock, his touch gentle, almost reverent. It was like he was feeling something that only he could see, memories so deeply embedded in this place that they were part of the wood itself. I can still hear him, you know, he added after a moment. Telling me stories. Laughing at his own dumb jokes. I spent years thinking I'd come back here with my own son someday. My throat tightened. You did, I whispered. He turned his head slightly, giving me a small, tired smile. We sat there for what felt like hours, just being there together. There was no need for grand gestures or emotional speeches. This was enough. This was everything. Eventually, the sun started to dip behind the trees, casting golden light over the water. I glanced over at my dad and saw that his eyes were closed again, not in exhaustion, but in peace. Thank you, he said softly. For bringing me home. I swallowed past the lump in my throat, gripping his hand in mine. Anytime, Dad. That was the last time we ever went on a trip together. He passed away a few weeks later. But in that moment, sitting beside him on that old wooden dock, I knew that he wasn't afraid anymore. He had found his way back to the place that made him feel young, safe, and whole. And I will always be grateful that I could give that to him. Story number 3. I took in a foster child for a weekend, and ended up adopting him for life. It was supposed to be just a weekend. That's what I told myself. That's what everyone told me. When I signed up to be a short-term foster parent, I had no plans to adopt. I wasn't even sure if I was ready to be a parent at all. But something inside me kept nagging. If I could give a child even just a few days of safety, warmth, and kindness, wasn't that worth it? So I took the classes, filled out the paperwork, and waited. Then, one Friday afternoon, I got the call. We have a placement for you. It's temporary, just for the weekend. Can you take him? His name was Ethan. He was 6 years old. I remember standing in my doorway as the social worker brought him in. He was so small, clutching a plastic bag with all of his belongings, which wasn't much. A few clothes, a worn-out stuffed dinosaur, and a toothbrush. That was it. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the floor, shoulders hunched, his tiny fingers gripping the strap of his bag so tightly his knuckles turned white. I knelt down to his level and gently said, "Hey, Ethan. I'm Sarah. You're gonna stay with me for a few days, okay?" He barely nodded. That first night, he wouldn't speak. He wouldn't eat much either, just a few bites of the mac and cheese I made before pushing his plate away. When bedtime came, he stood in the hallway, silent and frozen, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to go into the room I had set up for him. "This is your room, buddy," I told him. "You can put your stuff anywhere you like." He hesitated, then walked over to the bed, placing his stuffed dinosaur on the pillow. But he didn't get in. He just stood there, stiff, unmoving. "Would you like a nightlight?" I asked. Again, a tiny nod. I plugged one in, filling the room with a soft, warm glow. Still, he didn't move. "Do you want the door open?" This time, he finally spoke, a whisper so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "Yes." I kept the door open that night. And every night after that. The first night was the hardest. Ethan barely slept. Every time I checked on him, he was still wide awake, curled up tightly on the edge of the bed like he was trying to make himself as small as possible. His stuffed dinosaur was clutched so hard against his chest I was afraid it might tear. I sat outside his door for a long time, listening to his small, uneven breaths, wondering what this little boy had already been through in his 6 short years. By the next morning, I had convinced myself not to get attached. This was temporary. I had to remind myself that. The plan was clear: he'd be here for the weekend, and then he'd go to another foster home or back to social services until they found a more permanent placement. But by Saturday evening, I already knew that wouldn't happen. Ethan barely spoke, but he watched everything. His eyes followed me when I made breakfast, when I fed the dog, when I folded laundry. He studied me, like he was trying to figure out if I was safe. Then, that night, something small, but life-changing, happened. We were sitting on the couch, and I was flipping through channels, trying to find something he might like. I landed on an old cartoon, one I vaguely remembered from my own childhood. And for the first time since he arrived, Ethan smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real. I almost missed it, but my heart stopped when I saw it. I took a chance. "Do you like this show?" A small nod. I set the remote down and let it play. For the first time all weekend, he relaxed. He leaned into the couch cushions, his tiny hands resting in his lap instead of clenched in his lap. He didn't speak much, but when he let out a small giggle at something on the screen, I felt something inside me crack wide open. That night, as I was tucking him into bed, he did something that made my throat tighten. Instead of just lying stiffly under the covers like before, he hesitated for a moment, then reached out and held my hand. Just for a second. Just long enough for me to know he was starting to trust me. And that was it. That was the moment I knew. I wasn't just fostering him for the weekend. I was never letting him go.